Hi, I'm Lynn Cornell, and welcome to Journey Through the Bible Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study through each book of the Bible, verse by verse and chapter by chapter. I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're reading from a different Bible translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. We're going to continue in our study through the Gospel of Mark, and we're in chapter 15, verse 1. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests had a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin. After tying Jesus up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Now, if you remember, one of the strategies of the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, this was the ruling body. And by the way, it's interesting that they're all represented here. That you see the elders. The elders are a group of about 70. The chief priests. Then the scribes, they were a part of the sort of priests, but they were also the lawyers. They were the experts in the law. They also kind of transcribed the law. In other words, they wrote the law down. They would write it. They would copy the law. And then, of course, the Sanhedrin was the ruling body. And, of course, all of this was subject to Rome, which is why they had to conduct this meeting in the night, because they did not have the authority under Rome to execute anyone. I mean, if it was just Israel, Jesus would already have been dead. And the strategy was to have this trial, and this was during the night, which from a timeline, if you remember, probably on Thursday night, Jesus would have his Last Supper. Then he would go out into the garden late into Thursday night, actually going into Friday morning, where he would spend that time in the garden praying. And then there in the garden, he would be arrested and then taken to the high priest's palace. And it was there where they had this mock trial, where they fabricated charges against Jesus. Remember, the arrest was illegal because it was based upon a lie. It was a false witness. Judas had coveted for 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. And then they fabricated all of these charges. And the whole mindset here was that they had attempted to arrest Jesus in front of the crowd, and that failed. It almost sparked a riot. And they knew that they did not have a just reason to arrest him. So by arresting him away from the crowd, having this trial, by the time they present him to Pilate and the crowd, it was easier to make the charges stick. It was easier to push the people because the crowds are fickle. So that's what they did. And so this was all like Thursday night. So now it is early Friday morning. And the Pharisees really, in some respect, not in some respect, the Pharisees are really kind of pressed because this was a high holiday. It was the annual Passover. And they wanted to have all of this business wrapped up by sundown so that they can celebrate lawfully, ironically, they could lawfully celebrate the Sabbath day. In fact, they wouldn't even go into the temple of Pilate. They stood outside so that they wouldn't be defiled. That's by the law. Kind of shows you the religious mind. And they didn't mind lying and fabricating a false case against a person. That was okay to them. But they would not step foot inside of Pilate's hall. Pilate had to come out to them so that they would not defile or be defiled. Now, verse 2. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You have said it." Now, this is the charge. After all of that, this is the charge. Pilate is not asking him, "Are you leading a rebellion?" And you probably, in the question, by asking, "Is he the king of the Jews?" that this could be not so much as a trick question, but if Jesus had said that, "Yes, I'm the king of the Jews," then that could be viewed as treason against Rome that he was going to lead a rebellion against Rome, and that charge could have stuck. Verse 3, and the chief priests began to accuse him of many things, and Pilate questioned him again. Are you answering anything? Look at how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still did not answer anything, so Pilate was amazed. Now this was, one of the best defense in some cases is to just not say anything. And the reason why is because if you don't say anything, now in this case, the Pharisees, they had to try to make these accusations stick. And the more they talked, the more Pilate realized they have nothing. And basically, he's kind of looking at Jesus to say, just say the word. I can dismiss this. Politically, that would have been the easiest route for Pilate, because he, as I'll get into this later in the moment, one of the reasons why he doesn't just dismiss the case, it's political issues. Now, verse 6, at the festival, it was Pilate's custom to release for the people a prisoner they requested. And there was one named Barabbas who was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. Now, Barabbas was a zealot, and zealots were a thorn in Rome's side. They would spring up. They would try to overthrow the government. They always failed because proverbially they brought knives to gunfights. They did not have enough manpower. They did not have enough weaponry to overthrow the government. And so these attacks would always be like this little thorn pricks. But like all militant groups, they had their cause. Now, in this particular case, Barabbas led this rebellion, and in the course of this rebellion, he committed murder. And so and the irony here is that he is the one that is actually guilty. He is actually guilty of something, murder. And it kind of seems like Pilate is trying to throw the people a bone. Here is an actual guilty man, and this will backfire on them. Verse 8, the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them as he was accustomed. So Pilate answered them, do you want me to release the king of the Jews? Now, he's got almost like he was just assuming. You want me to release the king of the Jews? Here's a murderer. This guy actually committed murder. Verse 10, for he knew because of envy, the chief priest had handed him over. Now that's an astounding revelation right here, because if Pilate knew that, then again, why didn't Pilate just simply dismiss the case against Jesus? Again, history would tell us that Pilate had some political issues with Rome, and he could not afford an unrest. He could not afford an unstable situation. And so this possibly was one of the reasons what kind of guided him, why he's treading so lightly. In fact, he didn't even like the Jews. Historically, you find this attitude with Rome. They didn't like the Jewish people. But so Pilate had to tolerate them. Verse 11, the chief priest stirred up the crowd so that he would release Barabbas to them instead. And Pilate asked them, then what do you want me to do with the one you are called King of the Jews? Now, you may ask, when did they call Jesus King of the Jews? Well, they kind of proclaimed that, remember, when Jesus rode in on the donkey and they shouted, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Right? So they, verse 13, again, they shouted, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What has he done wrong? And remember, they never answered that, but they shouted, crucify him. All the more than willing to gratify the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, again, this is very interesting that here you handed a murderer over to somebody who is actually guilty, and you crucify an innocent man. All right. One more astounding thing here. This very crowd, and they were being edged on by the Pharisees. But this very crowd, just a few days earlier, as I mentioned earlier, was shouting, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This very crowd, just a few days earlier, were being healed by Jesus. We're hearing the good news of Jesus, and yet they're calling out to him. They're crying out for him to be crucified. Now that's interesting. All right, verse 16. Verse 16. Then the soldiers led him away into the courtyard, that is, the headquarters, and called the whole company together. And they dressed him in a purple robe and twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they kept hitting him on the head with a reed and spitting on him. Getting down on their knees, they were paying him homage. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe, put his clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Now, this was the experience here was a very, very unpleasant experience. Today, if we was to evaluate this kind of treatment, we would have said that Jesus would have been brutalized. Police brutality. They kind of thought of the justice system differently, that if you were presumed guilty, you had no rights. You had no expectation of humanity. And that's what you see here, that they forced Jesus. They abused Jesus. They did all kinds of things to him. I mean, in terms of brutality, beating him and all that. For them, forcing him to, stand up with a robe on, and they would, as they mocked him, they would slap him. They would rap him on the head with a reed. And so the whole thing was humiliating. It was an abuse. Verse 21. Then they forced a man coming from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. And he was Simon the Cyrenian, of the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, if you remember, Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount that if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. And this was actually kind of a law that a Roman soldier can just kind of force you into service. And basically, if he needed you to carry something, he could kind of force you to carry up to 1 mile. And of course, Jesus would say on the Sermon on the Mount to his disciples, well, if they force you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. Okay. The point I'm bringing this up is this is an example of that law right here. That they're forcing him to carry his cross. And one of the reasons why, of course, they had to probably force Jesus, if you kind of go back into when they handed him over to the soldiers, they flogged him. And one of the things that Pilate was hoping that the flogging itself would dissuade the people, and it didn't, which baffled him. He couldn't understand why they were crying out so for blood. But that flogging was so brutal. It was they used what's called a cat o' nine tail. It was a whip that had 3 straps to it, and each strap had bits of bones and metals embedded in it, so that it would scratch, it would lacerate, it would rip your flesh as it would hit you. And in fact, some people even died from the beating itself, the whipping itself. And if you think about it, you were actually getting 3 lashes for 1. Every time they would hit you with 1, the 3 straps would tear into your flesh. So if they gave you 20 lashes, in reality they was giving you 60. And so from that, you imagine the beatings. And remember, they wasn't just slapping him, they was hitting him, they was punching him. And so, weak from the abuse he experienced in the palace, his body was weak. And one of the things they would do is they would tie the cross beam of the cross on you. And then they would parade you through town. Well, Jesus probably collapsed. And so what they did was, they had Simon here probably carry the crossbeam to the crucifixion site. All right, I'll pick up with the verse 22 in the next video, so I'll see you then.